Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar series on managing drought in the Southern Plains. I'm Mark Schaefer with the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program. I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Margaret Boone, SCIP Program Manager, is managing the webinar. Today's webinar topic is drought impacts on public health. Brian Fuchs, climatologist and drought monitor author at the National Drought Mitigation Center, will begin with an update on the current drought status and outlook for the next several months. Brian will be followed by Jay Wright from the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality and Dr. Bill Schaffner from Vanderbilt University. Jay will talk about blue-green algae, what it is, and how drought influences its growth. Bill will discuss west-nile virus and some reasons why the drought has caused the virus to be more widespread this year. I'm sure that Bill would also like to welcome Texas A&M to the SEC as a fellow SEC member at Vanderbilt. We have several. We have several state climatologists on the call as well to talk about some of the more local changes within our region. I know that Mary Knapp from Kansas and Dave Dubois from New Mexico will be joining us. This is part of an ongoing series made possible through the support of several organizations, including the National Drought Mitigation Center, National Integrated Drought Information System, and NOAA Regional Climate Services. We also greatly appreciate those of you who join us in this webinar series and recognize the valuable time that you commit to participating. You may ask or make questions or comments at any time through typing in your chat box. We will address questions either as we go along, if possible, or at the end of the presentation. Each webinar is recorded and posted on the SCIP YouTube channel. Slides and summaries from previous topics are posted on the Unitas Drought portal in the Southern Plains region and on the SCIP website. You can also friend SCIP on Facebook for updates. I will now turn it over to Brian for an update on drought conditions and outlooks. Brian?
All right, thanks, Mark. Again, my name is Brian Fuchs. I'm a climatologist here at the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and one of the drought monitor authors. And I'm going to give an update of conditions, a couple forecast products, and a couple other products I threw in there this time, a little bit different, as well as the seasonal drought outlook. So first slide. Here is today's U.S. Drought Monitor map. And, oh, excuse me, going back to July, I'm sorry, I forgot I had put in several of the other maps. But going back to July, you can see this was from 2 SCIP webinars ago. And you can kind of see where the drought was, where it was developing by mid-July, beginning of July. We were seeing a lot of the areas of the Midwest. But down in the Southern Plains, things were kind of holding their own outside of West Texas and eastern New Mexico. Portions of Arkansas were drying out fairly well. Next slide. We can go to August then. You can kind of really see where the drought developed in the Midwest and Central Plains, including Oklahoma and portions of Kansas. Never really recovering in portions of West Texas and eastern New Mexico from last year even. And next slide, we can go into the current map. And what we're looking at here is a mix of some changes across the country here the last few weeks, with Isaac coming on shore, going up through Louisiana and Arkansas, and then into portions of the eastern Corn Belt. We did see some improvements. East Texas has been fairly wet over the last few months, as well as into portions of Louisiana. So you are seeing some drought-free and abnormally dry conditions in that part of the area. But then in other portions of the region, such as southwest Kansas, western Oklahoma, the Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, even into southwest Colorado, and even extending just the past few weeks, we've seen quite a bit of drought expanding into central and southern Texas. There just really has not been much relief, and the temperatures, which have played a big role in this drought throughout the entire summer, have stayed elevated. So not a good situation going into the fall for much of these areas. Right now, we have about 64% of the country in drought, which with this map that was released today, this was the most that we'd shown at any time through the summer months and into the fall. So this is the biggest drought footprint so far this year. Next slide. Going into these tables here, I highlighted that we are at 64.16% of the lower 48 in drought right now, and we're seeing a little over 6% in D4. If you go to the top of those tables there, last year at this time we were about 30% of the country in drought, and about 11 in D4, and a lot of that was in the southern plains. So we've seen some shifts of where we're seeing drought. Some of those same areas are still in drought, but really the D3 and D4 areas, the primary areas, have shifted out of the southern plains outside of Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma, southwest Kansas, eastern New Mexico, and more so into Nebraska, more of northern Kansas, northwest Kansas, into Wyoming and South Dakota at this time. Next slide. Now going back to July, here's what the skip region looked like. At that time, about 85% of the region was in drought. Then we'll move ahead to August on the next slide. About the same percentage in drought, about 84% during that time. We did see a little uptick in D4 at that time, mainly over Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. I'll go to the current map then here on the next slide, September 11th. And what we're seeing is a definite uptick. About 83% of the area is in drought, but we really see the D2 to D4, D3 to D4, and D4 numbers really pronounced, and where we're seeing those areas develop. So a good indication is some of those areas that have been downgraded the last several weeks in New Mexico and the Texas Panhandle, as well as in northwest Kansas, that has extended further into Nebraska and Colorado, and also just some amazing pictures coming out of western Oklahoma of just how dry things are. I know Gary McManus shared some great grasshopper pictures that you wouldn't think you could get that many grasshoppers on one fence post, but it's possible. And then looking at some of those areas of central to southern Texas, we've really seen conditions continue to develop on the dry side again, and more issues, more impacts developing. One of the main things we're looking at right now this time of year is what's this going to do to winter wheat planting? How is this going to impact acres that are going to be planted or currently being planted? Because the lack of soil moisture is an issue, and I'll talk about that on a few other slides. So going to the next slide, it is soil moisture, and this is the NL-DAS product. It is about a week old. They have not been having too many regular updates on this product, so they've had some issues getting this out routinely, but I do like to look at it. This is the total column soil moisture in a percentile, and you can see, Nebraska stands out. We have been dry. But follow that trail down to the south and west. You can see western Kansas, eastern Colorado, into eastern New Mexico, the Texas Panhandle. You're talking total column soil moisture, which goes down several feet, is in the 5th percentile or less in many areas, and even lower than the 10th percentile in a lot of those areas. And we can back that up with some of the Mesonet data that's out there. It's dry, and it's dry deep down into the soil. It's going to take a lot of moisture to recharge that soil before we're going to eliminate any of these impacts related to agriculture or even the watershed, stock ponds, and all that. Rangeland definitely is taking a hit. Next slide is another soil moisture model. This is a multi-model soil moisture product that comes out of the University of Washington, and with some of the VIC work that they do. In a similar pattern, there was a couple of the models that go into this multi-model ensemble that were hardly showing any dryness in Nebraska, and you can kind of see that anomaly in the central part of the state, and also in portions of Oklahoma and Kansas, where for whatever reason some of these models just aren't picking it up. And that's why, as a drought monitor author, I don't use just one of these. I tend to look at all of them and follow the trends and see what they're doing. But you can really see through the central Rockies into the northern Rockies even some of that dryness, and that doesn't bode well for any excessive runoff going into next spring as well, and sending any relief into those waterways. So another soil moisture model here that I tend to look at, and it does show those dry areas quite well. Next slide. And I thought I would bring up stream flows right now too, because here we are towards the end. We are at the end of the meteorological summer and halfway through September already, and you can kind of see that cutoff of where we've seen some recent rains and an uptick in stream flows. This is the 14-day average, and the percentiles are listed below the map, and you can see all the way through eastern New Mexico. I don't think there's too many reporting gauges that are above that 10th percentile, just a few of them. And even as you get into that Trinidad area, in the northern part of the state. In southern Colorado, you can still see that extending, and even into eastern Colorado, and then into central Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, you see a lot of these red dots. So visually speaking, we're seeing areas that even with some of the rain that we've seen, we've had these upticks in upticks in the base flow, and then they've steadily declined, and some areas are running in those lowest 5th percentile. And how that corresponds to the drought monitor is when you start looking at anything at the 5th percentile or less, those are D3 to D4 conditions. And so you can see why we've had those widespread conditions being depicted on the drought monitor map. And this is just one of the indicators that are showing that, but I thought it was good to show. The next slide, I did a regional zoom of this, and you can just see the same thing, just a little bit fuzzier view, but we can see that, central Kansas to south central Kansas into Oklahoma. And you'll see some of these green dots intermixed. And even that, some of those, to be a green dot, you only need to be at the 25th percentile. And some of this comes into management as well, where water is being withheld and then sent downstream based on management decisions. So these are not all free-flowing waterways that we're recording, but definitely you can see some hydrology issues in the region. Next slide. Next is some products from the ACES suite of maps from the regional climate centers. Departure from normal over the last 30 days, it is showing, most departures are only in the 0 to 3 inches through Oklahoma, Texas, and into eastern New Mexico and Kansas. There has been a little bit wetter of a pattern, but temperatures have just maintained themselves. Down in the south part of Texas, you do see a departure over the last 30 days of 3 to 6 inches, and we have seen drought developing a little bit more over the last few weeks down there. Again, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, along the Gulf Coast where Isaac came ashore, it doesn't surprise me to see departures anywhere from 12 to 15 inches. Some of those areas were inundated during that event. Going back to the last 60 days, it doesn't look a whole lot different. You see some more areas that are starting to pop up on that 4 to 8 inch deficit. And those are fairly large deficits when you start talking about where they are not receiving rain. Next slide, please. Year to date, this is a good one to look at as well as the 12-month product down below. And you can see where East Texas into Louisiana, that's the mixed bag of drought-free and abnormally dry areas on the map, and they stand out quite well. That area of South Texas where we've seen drought developed, if you look at that 12-month departure down below, we're still seeing deficits of 12 to 16 inches along the coastline down there, and even inland they're 8 to 12 inches. So we are talking about some serious deficits. You go into the Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, and 8 to 12 inches in places. Even with some of the rain events that we have picked up, you're still talking about some significant deficits, and that in turn was reflected in the stream flow products and in those soil moisture products that we're showing. If you're still showing these deficits over the last 12 months, it does a lot to deplete not only hydrologic conditions, but also soil moisture, which is a big concern through those areas. Next slide. The 30-day SPI, just another way of showing that 30 and 60-day data. You can just see how tremendously dry it's been in Nebraska through both North and South Dakota and into Wyoming on both the 30 and 60-day. The 60-day shows a little bit better going into the foothills of Colorado into northeast New Mexico, and even western New Mexico starting to show up. With all the monsoonal moisture that we've had, it doesn't seem like it's really pushed too far to the east. There has been some events, but really focusing over that Arizona, Utah, Southern California, Southern Nevada area. Next slide. Okay, now a little bit of the outlook. Over the next 5 days, the system that pushed through the Central Plains yesterday is going to continue to push to the south and east. It's a nice cool day here in Nebraska, and we did have a pretty decent rain here in Lincoln last night, which is our first rain in about 2.5 months. So it was very welcomed for us, and you can see that moisture on the precipitation product down below keeps pushing through. If we see these amounts going through Texas and Oklahoma, definitely could see some potential easing of the drought, maybe even some improvement in those areas, and even up into the Corn Belt of Iowa and Illinois and Indiana. seeing some of those amounts of upwards of an inch of rain on top of the precipitation they had, we may even be able to show further improvement. Along with those rains, we see temperatures anywhere from 6 to 9 degrees below normal over the next 5 days, and then we see some warmer temperatures behind it. But then again, it looks like we're going to be in a more active weather pattern as well. So kind of wait and see what's going to happen past this point. That gets into the next slide, the 8 to 14 day. And we're looking at those cool conditions for basically the eastern half of the country. These are the areas that have the best odds of being below normal for their temperatures. And then for precipitation, we're seeing near normal conditions potentially across Texas and Louisiana, kind of on the outer fringes of the best chances for below normal precipitation into Oklahoma and New Mexico, and that signal gets a little bit stronger into Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, especially the Pacific Northwest. So we will have to see how this all plays out. And going into the next slide, we have the seasonal outlook that came out at the end of August, and what we're looking at is for the month of September. On the upper left-hand panel, we're looking at temperatures that are predicted to stay above normal, and we have seen that for the most part, other than some cool downs mixed in there. That heat has maintained itself. Through much of the southern plains, though, equal chances of near normal conditions has been the forecast, and I think we've seen that outside of a few days where the temperatures with some of those low humidities have really jumped up in a hurry. We have seen more of a cooling trend in September, but then again, the last year has been well above normal, so this product doesn't surprise me too much. Then looking at the September precipitation, kind of that stronger monsoonal flow maintaining itself in Arizona, Southern California, Nevada, Utah. Some dryness is being indicated in the upper Midwest, and we've seen that over the last few weeks with some changes in the drought monitor, just seeing how dry some of these areas have been. And then the September, October, November products, it looks like the temperatures are going to maintain themselves through much of the country, and equal chances seem to dominate much of the precipitation products, with maybe some better chances along the Gulf Coast and even with the end of the monsoon season in the desert Southwest. Next slide. The seasonal drought outlook, this is the one that was released on July 5th. Really discussed a lot of this drought, where it was developing. See some white over Texas and Oklahoma. The white over East Texas didn't surprise me as much on this one, but the one in Oklahoma did. And the monsoon at this point was shifted to be a little bit further to the east. So then we'll go to the next product that came out in August, and we kind of see that monsoonal moisture pushed back to the west, but still some chances getting into New Mexico and Colorado. Much of those areas of Texas and Oklahoma filled in with drought persisting and developing all the way up into North Dakota. We did see that already. Persistence in the central and eastern Corn Belt. At that point, we really didn't know that a tropical system was going to be coming up the way it did. So we go into the next release, which came out last week. We see some of the Midwest showing those improvements. And then the same with the monsoonal moisture in the Southwest. The areas in South Texas where we've seen drought expanding over the last few weeks, it's still coming up as maybe some improvement over those areas. And persistence is the main indicator here through much of Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, eastern New Mexico, into Montana and Nevada and the Great Basin area. So as we go in through the rest of the fall, kind of have this dividing line that of where we're going to see potential improvements and where we're going to see persistence. And then that drought area in between is really going to stay fairly constant from what we can tell. Next slide. This is my contact information, and I do need to leave early today for some other commitments. If you do have a question, you can type that in now. If not, maybe some of the other contributors can answer that at the end with some of the state climatologists. With that, I'll pass it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Brian. I think you've seen quite a bit of changes here in the last few slides with the track of Hurricane Isaac across the eastern part, but some parts we're really hoping for that rain the next few days across Oklahoma and Texas here. as well. One of the things that we see with drought a lot is we talk a lot about agriculture impacts and wildfires and some things we see like that, but not as much is known about the health impacts that are related to it. So we're very happy to have a couple of presenters here who are going to show us the relationship that we saw both last year and into this year with some of the health impacts. We'll begin with Jay, who's going to talk about blue-green algae outbreaks we've had here in Oklahoma. Jay?
Thank you, and I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to speak on this subject. This is an emerging issue in the state of Oklahoma and really kind of an emerging issue across the nation. So this is something that we're still learning about. Next slide. So what we'll talk about today is what blue-green algae are, why they're a problem, what causes and influences blue-green algae blooms. I'll give you a few examples of blooms we've had here in Oklahoma and what we've done to deal with them. We'll talk about public water supplies, and we'll also go into some statistics that our state health department has gathered on illnesses. Next slide, please. So why should we care about blue-green algae? Well, when it comes to drinking water supplies, in Oklahoma we have 215 public water supplies that get their water from a surface water source. And bottom line is ingesting algal toxins can make you sick. And so this is something that we want to protect the public from. On the recreational side, when it comes to recreational risk, recreational exposure can result in mild to serious adverse health effects. Most of those adverse health effects are unsubstantiated or initially attributed to other causes. There aren't any real definitive medical tests that can be done that says that the reason why a person got sick was because of blue-green algae poisoning. And finally, with pets and livestock, they are particularly susceptible to suffering effects from exposure to algal toxins. Next slide, please. So what are blue-green algae? Well, up until the last few years, there's been a debate, and they really weren't sure whether to classify it as an algae or whether to classify it as bacteria. They finally come down on the side of classifying it as bacteria. They are bacteria that get their energy through photosynthesis, and they've been around for millions and millions of years. They are a very primitive organism. They're typically present in almost all surface waters in small numbers, but under certain conditions, they can rapidly reproduce in what we refer to as a bloom and become the dominant phytoplankton in that aquatic ecosystem. And blue-green algae can produce powerful toxins that can cause illness and death in humans and animals. Next slide, please. So what do blue-green algae blooms look like? Well, typically they come in two different variations. One is spilled paint, where they kind of tend to collect on the surface. You get streaking. They can be some very bright colors of green and turquoise. And the other variation is really just pea soup. Very dense growths of algae that are distributed through the water column. Next slide, please. Here in Oklahoma, here are some typical examples of blue-green algae that we have. The top picture that you see there is Anabina. The next one lower and to the right is Microcystis. The third one is, there are actually two different genera there. The bottom is Merismapedia, and the top, the cells on top are Oscillatoria. You'll notice that they are pink. You can actually have a pink blue-green algae bloom. And then finally, the one on the bottom is Cylindrus spermosus. Next slide, please. Most genera of cyanobacteria can produce more than one toxin. But usually not all species within a single genus will produce cyanotoxins. And blooms don't always produce toxins. And it's really not well understood right now what the triggers are that cause that toxin production to begin. But what we do know is that blooms can go from producing little to no toxin to producing significant amounts of toxin within a matter of hours. Next slide, please. And really, we're looking at three different classes of cyanotoxins that we are concerned about. One are dermal toxins or endotoxins. These are irritants. They're not exactly the same, but a way to look at these are kind of like poison ivy. Some people are going to be more susceptible to their effects than others. But the endotoxins come in the form of lipopolysaccharides. They're present all the time in the cell walls of blue-green algae. They can cause rashes, upper respiratory problems, and gastrointestinal issues. The second class of toxins are neurotoxins, affecting the nervous system. Again, they are sometimes produced. And the two neurotoxins that we are most concerned about are anatoxin and saxitoxin. And the final class of toxins that we're concerned about are the hepatotoxins, which affect the liver. And again, they are sometimes produced. And the two examples that we look to that are hepatotoxins are microcystin and cylindrospermopsin. Next slide, please. This is just an example of the potency of various cyanotoxins. Microcystin and cylindrospermopsin are the algal toxins. And as you can see, when you compare them to other natural toxins that we're familiar with, like nicotine, various snake venoms, they are same class or even more potent than the snake venoms. But they are not as potent as the botulinum toxin, which is the most potent natural toxin that we know of. Next slide, please. Some symptoms of blue-green algae exposure: rashes, flu-like symptoms, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, upper respiratory issues. There can be neurological symptoms: numbness, weakness, and vertigo. And if you have been exposed to blue-green algae and your doctor is pretty sharp and on top of things, they will do a liver profile because you can definitely damage your liver with exposure to some of these algal toxins. Next slide, please. There are some public health guidelines out there, but this is an area where EPA is still exploring and doing their homework. They have not issued a lot of information on algal toxins, but microcystin is on EPA's contaminant candidate list for regulation for public water supplies. And the World Health Organization has issued or has suggested a 1 microgram per liter or part per billion level of microcystin in public water supplies to protect long-term health. On the recreation side, again, the World Health Organization has issued guidance, and they break it out from a low risk to a very high risk based on either cell density or the concentration of microcystin toxin. In Oklahoma, this last spring, our legislature passed Senate Bill 259, which says that in Oklahoma, we will issue recreational advisories when cell counts exceed 100,000 cells per mil of cyanobacteria and microcystin concentrations exceed greater than 20 micrograms per liter. Next slide, please. Why do blue-green algae blooms occur? Basically, it comes down to food and comfort. And the food comes in the form of the nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus. These come from agricultural runoff, wastewater treatment plants, and septic tanks, fertilizer, urban stormwater runoff. Weather, hot, dry, sunny, and windless are the prime conditions for blue-green algae blooms to occur. Next slide, please. How does weather affect the frequency and duration of blue-green algae blooms? Again, the hot, dry, sunny, and windless conditions are ideal for blooms to occur. Low lake elevations result in increased loading of nutrients when runoff events occur. In Oklahoma, a lot of our lakes are now at the point where they're classified as either eutrophic or hypereutrophic. And as nutrients wash into the lakes, they get cycled down into the sediments. And at this point, those nutrients get cycled back out of the sediments into the water column. When we get runoff events right now with our lake elevations low, we're only washing more nutrients into the system. We're getting higher concentrations of nutrients in the water column. And because we're not getting any outflow out of those lakes, we're not washing any of those nutrients out. And so the nutrient levels just continue to build. And so this sets up a ready and ample food supply for blue-green algae. In Oklahoma, we have a lot of lakes that have suspended clay. A lot of our lakes are typically red in color. Prolonged dry periods allow for that suspended clay to fall out of suspension and go to the sediments. This increases light penetration, which the light is required for the algae to reproduce. Our warm 2011 and 2012 winter allowed blooms last year to continue into December, and then after a short respite, they started again in March. This was particularly a problem in Lake Texoma. And what we have noticed this year with our blooms starting earlier and us going back to the same lakes on a monthly basis to collect samples, that our blooms have persisted longer, but the makeup of the algal community has changed over time. Early in the season, back in May, our lakes had a lot of microcystin producers. Those algal communities have changed over time to where the samples that we've collected lately, we're seeing a lot more cylindrospermopsin producers. And so we have to be aware of this, and we have to make adjustments as we test for toxins. Next slide, please. In 2011, that was the first year that we had dealt with blue-green algae blooms in Oklahoma, other than a few isolated ones. We had 11 lakes where we investigated and responded to blue-green algae blooms. In 2012, so far, we have had 24 lakes where we've had reports and investigated blue-green algae blooms. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you a couple of examples that we've had to deal with. The first major bloom that we had in Oklahoma was at Grand Lake, and this happened in late June of 2011. We had been observing what had been happening in other states around us, mainly Kansas, who's been dealing with some serious blue-green algae problems since about 2003 or 2004. And we expected at some point in Oklahoma we would also be dealing with these problems. What we didn't expect was having to make a decision as to whether we were going to tell 250,000 people who were heading to Grand Lake for the 4th of July weekend that they would not be able to get in the water, but that was exactly what we were faced with. A little background on Grand Lake. It's in northeast Oklahoma. It's northeast of Tulsa. It's a large lake, 46,000 acres. It's 40 miles in length. It's one of the premier recreational lakes in Oklahoma. It's managed by the Grand River Dam Authority, and it is unusual in the state of Oklahoma that you can own lakefront property. And because of that, the shoreline is highly developed. There are many million-dollar homes on the shores of Grand Lake. It also serves as a source for 11 public water supplies. Next slide, please. Early when, in the life of the bloom, this was an aerial shot that was taken, and you can see how what little wind there was pushing the bloom up against the leeward shore. But this was pretty typical for how the coves looked. And at this point, the main body of the lake still looked fairly clear from a visual aspect. Next slide, please. By Friday, July 1st, this was a shot from the main body of the lake. You can see the streaking through there. Next slide, please. And again, here's another shot. This is down by the dam. You can see how the bloom is extending back out of this cove, out into the main body of the lake. This is in 90 feet of water. And we just didn't expect to see a bloom of this magnitude in waters this deep. Next slide, please. So what happened? There were flooding rains in the watershed in May, and it loaded up the lake with nutrients. The weather almost immediately turned in June, and it ended up being the second hottest June on record. Under normal conditions, there would have been a slower ramp up of water temperatures. There would have been transitioning from non-harmful green algae to conditions that favored blue-green algae. But the August-like conditions that occurred in June and the ample food supply favored the growth of blue-green algae. As you can see, from June 24th, when the bloom started, till July 5th, when the bloom basically collapsed, the nutrient levels dropped precipitously. And basically, by the 5th of July, there was not enough food in the system to support a bloom of that magnitude. Next slide, please. This is a lake that we've dealt with this year. This is very unusual. Clear Creek Lake is in southern or south central Oklahoma. It is managed by the city of Duncan. It's about a 600-acre lake. And at the time this bloom occurred, it was 9 feet below its typical elevation, and had not been to its typical elevation in at least 3 years. But we got a call from the city of Duncan, and it was reported to us that a family had been swimming at the lake, and within an hour after they left, their dog died. And within a couple hours after that, their 4-year-old child became ill, and they took the child to the emergency room. The doctor immediately suspected blue-green algae poisoning. And so we were out the next day. And when we got there, we saw no visual indication of a bloom. But we went ahead and collected samples, brought them back, and once we got them under the microscope, we discovered, much to our surprise, that there were 600,000 cells per mil of Cylindrospermopsis in the water. Cylindrospermopsis is more of a subtropical species. It likes to hang out 2 to 3 feet below the water. But it really surprised us that there was just no chlorophyll there. And so this is something new that we're dealing with and we're looking into and really trying to get a handle on it. Next slide, please. This was another very unusual occurrence. In late July, we got a report of a bloom on the Cimarron River in north central Oklahoma. This was a bloom of Anabina at 16 million cells per mil. That's very high. It extended from the town of Oilton to the upper reaches Keystone Reservoir. Normally, with normal flow, I don't think that you would ever see this. Stream flows were in the bottom 10th percentile for this time period. I've been looking at streams in Oklahoma for 30 years. I have never seen anything like this. Nobody I know of or have talked to has ever seen a bloom of this magnitude in a free-flowing stream in Oklahoma. Next slide, please. Public water supply response is what my agency is focused on now. And whenever a bloom is reported at a lake, the first thing that we do is our public water supply engineers call all the public water supplies that draw from that lake, and they talk to them about operational changes they can make to reduce the likelihood that algal toxins will show up in their finished water. And those operational changes usually consist of making sure that they're drawing their water from the deepest intake possible. They want to remove the algae cells intact before applying any oxidant or anything that would kill the algae cells, because when the algae cells die, they lyse, and whatever toxins they contain will be released. So the idea is to go ahead and filter those out and remove them from the process before you start adding any type of oxidant or disinfectant. Disinfectant after the algae cells are removed is very effective at destroying the toxin, and then the final step, they can add activated carbon to absorb any toxins that are left. We go out to each of these public water supplies and we sample for the appropriate algal toxins based on what general we see. And we sample both the raw and the finished water of these plants. We do that monthly as long as the bloom is occurring. And we've collected paired samples at 62 public water supplies in the last 2 years. We have seen reportable levels of several of these toxins in the raw water, up to 2.5 micrograms per liter per microsystem. But in the finished water, we've only had some very low-level hits for a couple of the toxins. These are barely above our analytical reporting level. And so we feel pretty good about our response, and that algal toxins are probably not making it through public water supplies and are not being served to the public. Next slide, please. Our State Department of Health has gathered statistics on illnesses that are possibly related to blue-green algae exposure. And so in 2011, they had 74 reports of illness possibly related to blue-green algae exposure. And these were people who either self-reported or sought medical attention, and their clinician or physician reported. You can see some of the symptoms that they reported. The symptoms are about the same in 2012 as they are for 2011. In 2011, 27 of those received medical care. 1 was hospitalized with secondary pneumonia. In 2012 so far, they've had 46 reports of illness, possibly related to blue-green algae exposure. 3 received medical care and none have been hospitalized. Next slide, please. So conclusions, blue-green algae will continue to be an issue in Oklahoma and I'm sure other states. Blue-green algae is influenced by weather and climate, but not in ways that are always obvious or expected. And an example of that is in the near term, rainfall and runoff events may make conditions worse until our lakes get back to more normal elevations and we get some outflow of some of these nutrients. Longer term, if the climate change models are correct, which predict for Oklahoma at least more frequent and longer lasting heat waves and droughts and more frequent floods, this would likely result in more frequent blue-green algae blooms. Next slide, please. I do want to acknowledge some folks, Dr. Tony Clyde of the Army Corps of Engineers, the Tulsa District, and Dr. Robert Lynch of the OU College of Public Health are two of the premier blue-green algae scientists in the state. I have talked to them a lot in the last couple of years as this has become an emerging issue, and they've provided invaluable advice. And also our staff here at DEQ and the State Environmental Laboratory Services. These are the folks that go out and collect our samples and do the analysis, and they have worked their tails off in the last couple of years. So with that, thank you. Do we have time for questions? Are there any questions?
Thank you, Jay. And I think that was quite a sobering look at what's going on, but I'm very encouraged to hear that our drinking water is fine thanks to the been doing. I didn't see any questions posted yet, so we'll move on. I just want to mention that Nicole has a link in the chat to a drought and public health effects webinar series that is held by the CDC. You might check those out. We can get back to questions at the end, so if you have questions, please type them. We'll go on now to Bill Schaffner, who's going to look at the West Nile virus and what we've seen with this year. So, Bill.
Yeah. So thanks. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm an infectious diseases physician at Vanderbilt, but I work very, very closely with colleagues at the Tennessee Department of Health and the CDC on a whole array of public health projects. And obviously, West Nile virus is very much in the news. So the next slide, please. So West Nile virus is a virus whose reservoir, natural reservoir, the place it exists in nature, is in birds. And it's transmitted among the birds by mosquitoes. Those mosquitoes, if infected, can occasionally not bite a bird, but bite a human, and that results in transmission then to people. Now, this virus oughtn't to be in the Western Hemisphere. It naturally occurred in Africa, the Middle East, India, and other countries. But in 1999, it was introduced into the United States in the northeastern part of the country, in and around New York City. The thought is probably by airplanes that carried infected mosquitoes into this country. There are a few other theories, but they're all theories, so no matter. It was introduced into the United States in 1999 and got a foothold. So let's posit that there were infected mosquitoes. They began to bite birds. The birds became a reservoir, and mosquitoes biting more birds became infected, and then they went on their migratory fashion to the south, came back the next year, and also because the winter of 1999 was not all that severe, and because the virus was introduced in and around New York City, it is thought that the mosquitoes overwintered in the subways of New York City. It now had a foothold in the United States, and then subsequently over the next several seasons spread down the eastern seaboard and then across the country in a stepwise fashion, causing a sequential series of illnesses and also bird die-offs some bird species, blue jays, crows, for example, are more susceptible to illness and death. Using the enormous sample of our backyard here in Nashville, once West Nile came into Middle Tennessee, we lost all the blue jays in our backyard. They're only now slowly coming back. So already we see that this newly introduced virus is establishing itself ecologically, trying to figure out what its own ecologic niche is in this hemisphere, and in particular in the United States. And it clearly involves bird populations, their migrations, the proportion of birds affected and dying, whether others are surviving, and equally mosquitoes. And if those mosquitoes overwinter and are infected, you can expect a revving up of West Nile human cases the next season. So let's look at the next slide, which just says the same thing. It's a complex ecology. It's evolving. As far as I know, nobody's crystal ball at the CDC in Atlanta or any of the rest of us is very clear. Each season has been somewhat different. Nobody makes predictions, and clearly many disciplines are involved and have contributed information to our still quite small but growing knowledge of the ecology of West Nile virus. Well, let me pause for a moment and talk a little about the illness in humans. So humans are bitten by an infected mosquito. The virus is transmitted to us, and fortunately, in the vast majority of cases, we remain without symptoms. So the body fights off the infection. We don't get sick. So this is not a virus that is fiercely penetrant. That's a good thing. So basically, two kinds of illnesses can occur. The first is so-called West Nile fever. That's a flu-like illness with fever that also can be associated with a variety of other symptoms, not feeling terribly well, headache, you're off your energy, you lose your appetite. You detect that this is very non-specific. It's influenza-like, kind of, but without the cough. And although some of these people do have a little cough, but it's a very non-specific illness. So that's the most common illness that can be caused. And as you can imagine, relatively few of these people are hospitalized. They do not receive the more elaborate diagnostic attention that more severely ill patients do. And so the number of cases of West Nile fever that occur are really, everything considered, pretty modest. Are modestly recorded because they're not documented, and when those few documented cases are reported to health departments, they're considered the very, very tip of the iceberg. Now, the illnesses that we're more concerned about are what are called neuroinvasive illnesses, and that is that the virus, which causes West Nile fever, actually gets into the central nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord causes inflammation and results in meningitis, that's an inflammation of the covering of the brain, encephalitis, inflammation actually of the brain substance itself, and occasionally a kind of flabby paralysis because of involvement of the spinal cord that actually resembles crudely the old disease poliomyelitis. So neuroinvasive disease is the more serious. That's going to get you hospitalized, and that, more often than not, will trigger a series of diagnostic studies, a lumbar puncture, sending your cerebrospinal fluid off to a laboratory, taking some blood specimens, sending them to a laboratory for antibody serologic studies. And so it is those cases that receive the most attention. They're the most serious. Neuroinvasive disease tends to occur more frequently in persons older than 50 years of age, already just by age somewhat immunocompromised, more apt to have underlying illness, and it's in that population that we have most of the deaths. This year is the largest year in many. As of yesterday, reported to the CDC, and remember, reporting varies and it lags behind the truth. There's always a 2 to 3 week lag by the time the data are assembled in the states and sent on to the CDC in Atlanta. But as of yesterday, there were 1,405 neuroinvasive cases, and there were 118 recorded deaths. Those are after the initial wave of West Nile going through the country. Those are large numbers. The largest number of neuroinvasive cases in Texas, 526. The second most common state is a little bit of an anomaly. It's up in Michigan, and then we had Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Mississippi with cases in the double digits, in the high double digits. And so that's the current distribution of cases. So let's look at the last slide. So how is it that climate and arid conditions can possibly influence this complex ecologic circumstance? First is that warm weather permits, as it was relatively last winter, adult mosquitoes, some of whom are infected, to survive. And this starts the cycle a bit earlier and gets things going the next season. If you have a hot summer, the entomologists tell me that the virus in the mosquito, because of the increased temperature, actually replicates more rapidly, which increases the titer, the concentration of virus in the mosquito. So if the mosquito bites you, you're more likely to get an infection and more likely to get a serious infection. That's at least traditional for all infectious diseases. Bit of assumption here, but it's biologically plausible. Okay, that's the climate. Now, what about drought? One would anticipate, and this is counterintuitive, one would anticipate that in a drought, there's less standing water. If there's less standing water, there are fewer opportunities for mosquito breeding during the course of the summer. Correct, less standing water. But what happens is, in this also, we're getting out on the thin end of the limb here. We're moving more into speculation. But once again, the entomologists are talking about this. So what we have is much more localized opportunity for mosquito breeding. So we have less standing water, but the mosquitoes breed there. Now, given that it's a drought, the birds are attracted to those self-same water sources. There are fewer sources, so more birds go to the same water sources. That's where they encounter the mosquitoes. More apt for the mosquitoes to bite the birds, more apt for some mosquitoes to become infected and infect other birds, but also some of those mosquitoes are going to fly away and bite us. So the more limited water sources appear to act paradoxically as an accelerant of mosquito acquisition of virus, and then when the mosquitoes bite us, we become infected. Neat, if true, but that's currently a concept that is being discussed. Now, there are a couple of other things that have happened in our society. And here I now quote a couple of papers that have been published that are at least localized, that seem to show that from time to time in one season or another, some of these events might have contributed to at least the local splurge of West Nile infection due to increasing mosquito breeding habitat. The first is, who would have thunk it? This comes from Southern California. Default mortgages. They create enough problems. Who knew that they had an influence on West Nile? Default mortgages mean that people walk away from their homes. Some of those homes had swimming pools. The swimming pools are no longer maintained. They become large breeding sites for mosquitoes, and hence mosquito populations are increased. May be true. The other is that in some circumstances, you get overflow from irrigation that goes over onto lawns and creates puddles, and those puddles then become breeding sites for mosquitoes related to, at least in some localized areas, increased transmission and increased cases of West Nile virus resulting. So those are our current concepts. Now, it's full of holes, and you're entitled to ask every question you can think of. So how come just some drought areas are infected and not others? Beats me. It's got to have something to do with the frequency of the infection in birds, perhaps influenced also by their migratory patterns. There must also be micro events such as these mortgage and irrigation events that have been documented in only a couple of places that are occurring that we still have not recognized. But it's quite clear that as this virus establishes itself in the United States, it's now endemic, so it's part of us. It's still working out its ecology, and we're frankly still in our relative infancy in finding out, understanding all of the relative climatic, animal, human circumstances that will influence the epidemiology of infection in humans. I'm happy. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for inviting me to chat with you for a few minutes, and I'm happy to take your questions and suggestions.
Thank you, Bill. That's, again, like Jay's presentation, that really makes you think a little bit about these relationships that we didn't necessarily recognize before, and how much more work still needs to be done. We appreciate you sharing this with us. Before I get to the couple of state climatologists who are on the phone, I wanted to ask a couple of things. First off, back to Jay. You mentioned that there were more lakes affected with blue-green algae this year than last year, but there were fewer cases of reported health impacts or medical care this year. Why are there any ideas about why that might be improved over last year in some sense with more lakes affected?
I think there is more public awareness. There has been a campaign here in Oklahoma by our Department of Tourism to make people aware of what blue-green algae blooms look like. I think the slogan is, if it's green on top, stop. I think that's probably had a positive effect. Also, the one thing I didn't mention was Grand Lake did not bloom this year. Grand Lake didn't have the inflows, and the spring did not get the spring runoff that it did last year. And so they didn't have the bloom they had this year. And the difference between, I think, what was it, 46 and 72 were about the number of people who got sick at Grand Lake last year.
Wow. So one popular spot can make quite a difference there. I see Nicole had a question there for Bill asking about there are less mosquitoes during drought, especially up in Nebraska. So do we know whether it's people, the kind of the sites of infection, are they getting near these getting bit near these standing water sites, or are they traveling further away and more dispersed?
And the difficulty is that people's history, you know, if they get sick, about where they've gotten bitten by mosquitoes or even weather is so imprecise that it's hard to know. Bear in mind, I keep saying that we're still learning about that, but that's the kind of question to which we would like to have much better answers.
And one more kind of related to it, it mentioned, you know, there's fewer mosquitoes in some of the drought areas, you know, but then you mentioned the concentration. And one of the things last winter, we had such a warm winter that a lot of, perhaps a lot of mosquitoes survived in other parts of the state. You know, maybe Michigan comes to mind where they had a very warm winter up there. Is the wintertime kind of overwintering aspect or most important, or is it, you mentioned the hot summer and the rapid replication of virus?
Short answer, not entirely facetious, is beats me. I mean, since 1999, that's really a very short period of time for a virus to be introduced into a whole new continent and just sorting itself out, and for medical, veterinary science, climatologists, everybody to begin to really figure out the ecology of West Nile. And we're still feeling our way, and I would like everyone to understand that the concepts I've presented about the ecology and its frequency and the influence of drought are all kind of on the, we don't really know this stuff, but that's what we're talking about, and that's what people are now exploring.
Thank you. I think it shows the challenges ahead of us. So, so lots more to learn.
And if you don't mind, going to have to sign off unless there are other questions. No disrespect, it's just busy here today.
Yeah, I understand that, and I appreciate your participation. We did have a couple of state climatologists who are on the phone here and wanted to make some comments. Mary, are you still on the line?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, Mary.
Okay. Basically, just an update. We've had some fairly nice rains in the last couple of days. We're looking at some improving conditions. Probably more. Our temperatures are moderating even more than our getting our additional precipitation. So that's really where we're going to benefit. And just a side note on the West Nile, we haven't had a whole lot that I've noticed in Kansas this year, but several years ago we had some clusters of West Nile virus, and one spot that kind of lit up was the tubes near a reservoir, and that has that prime mix of get a lot of people congregating because they're fishing off of the pier by the tubes, got a lot of birds in the area, and of course there's a lot of pooled water that can be a source of the mosquitoes, so that's kind of an interesting note.
I'm glad that they haven't made it up there, and maybe it's like in Nebraska that that there isn't enough water there for even the mosquitoes. So.
Well, the birds are moving out to places where there's more. We'll see what happens next year.
Yeah. All right. And I think Dave, New Mexico, wanted to make some comments. Are you still there, Dave?
I'm here. Yeah, I just want to make it. I just saw a press release from related to this talk from the New Mexico Department of Health. It was they announced their first West Nile fatality of 2012. There was an elderly man from Bernalillo County died from the virus infection. So that was the first one this year. So it is an issue throughout the region.
And Brian earlier on had mentioned that that the drought has kind of been persistent there in New Mexico. You never really got the relief, and you really didn't get the monsoon rains that earlier in the season maybe been hoping for. Has that been your experience?
Yeah. We've had these actually some reports this morning of some rain, but over the past over this past 30 days, it's been not as good as we expected, and so we're winding down our monsoon period. So we'll see when it's going to happen.
Well, hopefully we'll get El Nino to kick in and bring some good snows across the southern part there.
That's the hope. We got our first sign of snow up in the mountains. I saw a tweet this afternoon, and I think it was Wheeler Peak area. So bring it on.
Right. Great. I don't see any other questions. So I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this webinar. So as a reminder, the webinar recording will be posted to the SCIP YouTube page, and our next webinar will be on October 11th at the regular time of 11 a.m. Central. We've also been recording weekly 5-minute briefings and posting those directly to the SCIP YouTube site. They appear every Thursday afternoon, or in some cases Friday morning. So watch our SCIP YouTube site for periodic updates as the drought continues to evolve rapidly. As we get into the cooler season, we may scale these back a little bit, but there's still been a lot of changes on a week-by-week basis. As always, we encourage you to continue to spread the word and make sure others dealing with the aspects of drought and some of these things that we haven't really thought of, like public health aspects, can tap into this and get support they need. Thank you for your time today. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the future. Hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thanks.